Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to Rivers of Living Water, a program offered by Mary Schwarz about how to grow in holiness and have a more intimate relationship with God. Jesus said in John chapter 7, "If anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink, and out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And now here's Mary Schwarz. Hi, Mary.
Hi. One of the ways Jesus fulfills his promise to give us living water is through the gift of contemplative prayer. The Church says contemplative prayer is not just for the great saints, but a gift God wants to give to all of us. We'll be talking about the virtues we need to grow in and how to pray so that we have a more intimate relationship with God and obtain this gift of contemplative prayer, this living water, which transforms us more and more into the likeness of Christ. Our guest today is Dr. Ronda Chervin, a distinguished Catholic writer and speaker. We'll be continuing our discussion of Dr. Ronda's book, Avoiding Bitterness and Suffering, about how the saints found peace in the midst of sorrow. Our topic today is meeting Christ in the suffering of marital discord. We hope you'll call us with your questions or comments if you're listening to us live. Our number is 515-604-9344. The code is 914121. I'll repeat that number a little later in the show, and you can also find it at wcatradio.com on the radio shows page. So, Dr. Ronda, welcome.
Hello. Well, this is a very heavy topic, and rather frightening and surprising to many people, and not married people. Married people are very familiar with marital discord and struggle to meet Christ within that discord in one sense or another, sometimes by getting out of the relationship if it's too abusive. But most people who are single or who are religious and have always been consecrated, they don't think of marriage in terms of this passage of St. Matthew, which I picked out to describe the sufferings of these saints. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Now, I use this word discord, which is kind of mild, but I wanted to include things that weren't as bad as battering or certain kinds of divorces. But under the title of marital discord, we will be dealing with such extremes as murder. Some saints were murdered by their husbands. Abandonment, infidelity, violence, raging scenes, and what we would now call psychological battering. Just on the humorous side, when I was married many years, and feminist groups started up where women would meet and talk about their experiences of being hurt as women in one way or another by men. Mm-hmm. And I was in one of these little groups, and I was amazed to hear about this new category, which is now very familiar. This was a good 30 years ago. Okay, psychological battery. And what could that mean? Well, what it means basically is it's one thing if a husband and wife have facts. You know, they disagree sometimes, and sometimes that disagreement gets very loud. That's one thing. But there are husbands and wives, too, actually, but they're less in number probably, but still they exist, who just all day long put down the spouse. Like every moment they're being critical or disdainful, and that's called psychological battery. So the humorous side of this, I was so thrilled to learn this category. I ran home and I said to my husband, you've been psychologically battering me for 30 years. And we both laughed and laughed because he didn't do that. But, it was just fun.
I'm glad you laughed.
Yes.
Scared me for a minute. Well,
yeah.
I'm a moral theologian and I took a class with Monsignor William Smith said to us once that, that kind of emotional abuse can be almost worse than physical abuse. It can be very serious.
Right, because we expect or we need, as well as, of course, we do need constructive criticism from the people around us because most of us are not saints. And even saints sometimes do things that need correction by someone. But that's different from this kind of just, battering, psychological battering.
Right.
Okay.
Tearing the person down deliberately all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Later in the show, we're going to be talking later in the show about how to respond to these things.
Right, yeah. It's not going to be all horror. But, however, many times this is unconscious in the victimizer. It's an unconscious mechanism, especially many people who do this kind of thing had similar things in their own childhood.
Yeah.
So themselves being psychologically or physically battered as kids, then they repeat this pattern, and they're not deliberately repeating the pattern. It kind of operates on many levels. But in any case, the most amazing saint for unhappily married or divorced people is our own American saint, Cornelia Conley. And her example is bizarre, but I like to tell her story partly to encourage people who think that their story of divorce was the worst, and I say, see if you could beat this one. She lived in the 19th century, 1809 to 1879, and she and her husband were Lutherans, and her husband was an Episcopal clergyman, and 4 years after their marriage, they prayed their way into the Roman Catholic Church. And he was, because he was an Episcopal clergyman originally, they taught in an American Catholic college, and everything seemed to be going very well. Now,
and they were Americans to begin with?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And now, all of a sudden, her husband, Cornelia Connolly's husband, Pierce, without any warning, said to her one day, I want to be a priest. Now, how can a married man with children become a priest? Well, even though it's extremely unusual, it used to be in many times back, centuries ago usually in the church, that sometimes a husband and wife, after their children were grown, usually after their children were grown, they would decide, they got all these graces, and he would decide he wanted to be a monk and she would become a nun. So there was precedence for this. But only if the other spouse agreed. So when she hears this thing, she's just absolutely horrified because she adores her husband. She has no desire to be a nun. And she's persuaded that he has a unique vocation by their spiritual advisors, and that also she could have a unique vocation because she's well educated, and so she could be a sister school teacher in England where they were just beginning to be allowed to have Catholic schools in England. They were trying to get that through the whole persecution by the Episcopal Church of Catholics. Okay. And so the idea is she would keep the children with her. So anyway, they go to Rome, and Pierce is ordained a priest, and their oldest son is sent to school in England, and she has the two younger kids with her, and she's working on the plans for an English order of sisters, which would be called the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, known in our times as the Holy Child Sisters. So that order now exists in the United States and many other places, and I actually met a sister from that order.
Yes, and they ran schools for girls, is that right, Rhonda?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, now, at this point, even though it might seem like a beautiful story with a happy ending, now comes the psychological battering part. Okay, Cornelia is running this convent in England, and Pierce decides he doesn't like being a priest after all. And so he comes to England and he says, Cornelia, don't take final vows, and you belong to me. And so
but he's already a priest.
Yeah, but he's left the priesthood.
Okay.
So now he says, so she decides to take her religious vows anyway, and he steals the 3 children from the schools they were in and flees with them back to Italy, where he goes back to being an Episcopal priest in Italy. Okay. And his idea was he would keep the children as hostages to win Cornelia back. Now you have to realize this is all involved in England, which was virulently anti-Catholic and opposed religious vows. So he reaches the point,
and she was very much vilified, wasn't she, in the English?
Yeah. So she is, yes. So he accuses the whole convent of being into scandal, and he goes to law to try to get her back. And he doesn't succeed. But how did she pray through this awful time? And here's an exact prayer she said. In union with my crucified Lord and by his most precious blood, in adoration, satisfaction, thanksgiving, and petition, I, Cornelia, vow to have no further intercourse with my children and their father beyond what is necessary for the greater glory of God and his manifest will through my director. So they don't drag her out of the convent, but she loses the kids to him.
What an incredible suffering, yeah.
So during this whole time, one of the most dramatic scenes that's depicted in the biographies is he comes to England and she won't talk to him. Mm-hmm. And so he fell weeping on the sofa of the convent parlor, and for the next few hours remained to rage and plead.
Yeah.
So she said she would only talk to him when he had restored at least her daughter to her. So then he begins to accuse Cornelius, the priest, of having assaulted Cornelia, and declares publicly that the convent is a brothel. Okay.
What a prince. Yeah, obviously he's mentally unstable, this man.
Right. Okay, so he gets the apparent victory, and it could have resulted
because
in
really all the Protestants were in complete sympathy with him.
Right.
All right.
And she could have gone to prison. She was advised to be ready to flee at a moment's notice. But she said, there is nothing to fear since God and truth are on my side. Okay. So he lives in Florence with two of the children, and so on and on and on. Okay, so her eldest son dies of yellow fever at 21, but her daughter is writing her rude letters. Occasionally, Adeline and Frank, the younger son, would visit her, but only to express their anger, leaving the nun with large tears in a pool in her lap.
So that must have been the worst of her suffering, was that her two living children rejected her.
Right. But then eventually her daughter did come back to the Catholic Church.
Yes.
So, okay, so...
After her death, you wrote in the book, yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, I don't think there are many divorce stories that are as bizarre or as horrifying as this one. But maybe there are, you know? So, but what do we learn from this? We learn that this woman, through her union, her deep, deep union with God in prayer, was able to get through all this, not without tears, not without grief, but she got through it. She survived and inspired all these young women. Now, maybe you can consider this ironic. She persuaded these young women that it would be better to be sisters in her order than to be married. That might have been rather easy.
I do want to say that a friend of mine went, and a friend of Rhonda's too, a very close friend of ours, Madeleine Stebbins, went to one of their schools as a young girl in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And the schools that Cornelia started were very wonderful. And they had a very wonderful spirit of warmth. You know, there was a lot of maternal warmth in the schools and a very good education. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the Holy Child order.
Yes. So here is she, and last I heard she is Blessed Cornelia Connolly, and then she will be probably canonized shortly. So she's a great American saint, and a real American saint for the divorced, you know.
Yes. Patron saint.
So she didn't. I mean, under those circumstances, who wouldn't have been just eaten up with bitterness, you know?
Yeah.
Without Jesus, it's really, like I like to say about these things, this is like the sixth proof for the existence of God.
Yeah.
Because without God's grace, how could anyone go through such a thing? Just reading about it, you're just flabbergasted at what God, now somehow, you know, then comes this question, how could God permit this? Marriage is a sacrament. Why does he permit this? And what do you say to people, because you're a spiritual guide to many people, Mary, and you know a lot about contemplative prayer and spirituality. What do you say to people who say, how could God let that happen?
Well, Rhonda, you may answer that question a little better than I. Of course, there's a little bit of a mystery here, but it does seem, I mean, obviously Cornelia would not have gone ahead and made her final vows if she didn't feel eventually that she was called to the religious life. And we don't, you know, and her daughter did become a Catholic after her death. We don't see the fruits. Well, we do see the fruits of some of the suffering in her, in her schools, in her work. Our lives don't end here, right? This is just the beginning. This is just the pilgrimage. We have to stop thinking that this is what it's all about. This is just the prelude to eternal life. Father Groeschel used to say that there were degrees of happiness in heaven. I think I may have mentioned this on the show before. And that, in fact, is what Catholic theologians have taught for many centuries. And I used to think that's crazy, but I believed it was true if he said it. But, St. Faustina experienced the different degrees of happiness in heaven, and she said you would suffer anything in this life to be 1 degree happier in heaven.
Yes, that's the whole point. I'd like to say, suppose you had never heard of the Olympics, and you've never seen an Olympic game, and you just see pictures of people training, sweating profusely, aching in their bodies, practicing for the Olympics, but you've never seen the Olympics and you don't know why they're doing all this. You would think, this is terrible. Why is anyone allowing people to make people suffer this way?
Mm-hmm.
Because
That's
you don't see the goal. You don't see the goal. So let us pray right now for all those who are in unhappy marriages, who may have been divorced under circumstances of physical battering or psychological battering. Oh, please, Jesus, you be the bridegroom of the soul of such women, and also the companion of men who have also been psychologically battered in different ways by women. Amen.
Amen. Yes, and we don't want to make that be, I'm certainly, I was thinking about Cornelia, but obviously these are very terrible sufferings, and we don't want to make light of them. I also, I said that St. Faustina said that, you would give anything to be 1 degree happier in heaven, but that is perhaps too self-centered, because what means more to a lot of people is that their children will be happy in heaven. That when you endure these things with God, you bring a lot of souls to heaven with you.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely so.
Okay. So tell us about some of the other, let me just say, I hope if any of you are listening to this and have questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. Call us at 515-604-9344. And then you'll have to enter a code, which is 914121, followed by the £. Okay, so Rhonda, you also have many stories of other saints.
Yes. One of the most famous, and I've always been sorry, St. Augustine, probably out of filial piety of some sort, he doesn't go into exactly how badly treated his mother, St. Monica, was by her pagan husband. It's just said that he was very ill-tempered and a lustful pagan husband, so the implication was he wasn't faithful to her. And he didn't beat her, though that was very common in those days. He didn't beat her because she was so gentle and patient and Christian. Mm-hmm. And eventually he did come into the church. So this is the thing that we have throughout these researches I did. In some cases, the husband...
Rhonda, we're a little bit losing you. Your voice is getting soft.
Oh, it's exactly the same. Okay, let's try. Is this better?
That's good. That's very good.
Okay. So,
So you said that something about the researchers?
when doing my research on these on marital discord, they vary greatly, where some of them will stay with their husbands and convert them, but some husbands never convert. So here's a tale which is absolutely terrifying. Saint Godelieve of Belgium of the 11th century. And like many of the saints who were married, she wanted to be a nun, but she was married for political reasons. See, marriages were not based on falling in love in former centuries. They were based on what the family thought would be good for the whole family if this and this marriage took place. Okay. Her mother-in-law wanted some other woman for her son, and treated Godelieve brutally to the point of confining her to a cell and all but starving her. Her husband went along with this treatment because he resented his wife being so holy. See, many times if a husband has a wife who is very holy, it makes him ashamed of himself, so he just hates her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this may seem to you just absolutely weird, but I have an experience in my own life which helped me to understand this. It went like this. My husband was disabled with crippling asthma, and we were afraid he was going to die of it. And some friends of mine brought him and me to this man who I just noticed at the same time yesterday as Cornelia Connolly's beatification. There's a servant of God who was in Los Angeles where we lived, and he was a wonderful saintly priest who was a healer. So they brought us to the chapel of his order, and they said, "We're sorry, you have a wait of about a half an hour. He can't come to you for a half an hour." Well, I'm sitting there praying for my husband's healing. And suddenly I get this feeling, if he's holy, I'm so unholy. He's a mystic healer. He's going to walk in and he's going to say, "Get that woman out of here. I can't heal her husband unless she leaves the chapel." I really started,
Rhonda.
I really started thinking this, okay? And so I had this temptation to run out of the chapel instead, which isn't like me because I'm very talkative and like to be center stage. I just remained in the background throughout the whole thing. And even though he wasn't totally healed, he lived another 20 years because of his healing. So it was successful. You know, Jesus did heal him through this. Then another time someone said, who was in the missionaries of charity of Mother Teresa, "Mother Teresa is coming through. Would you like to meet with her?" And I said, "Oh, I would love to meet with her, but maybe just for 10 minutes. Now, what is that? What I meant, somehow I was afraid if I actually was with her more than 10 minutes, I would have to change in some way. She would look at me and she would say, "If you really want to be holy, Rhonda, you have to do this," something like that. See, so even in people who are ardent Catholics, there's a fear of holiness.
Of what will be asked.
And this is a good reason why many people don't want to practice contemplative prayer, because they're afraid of being drawn closer, and then Jesus could ask you to do something you don't want to do. So we need to understand this a little better. Of course, that's different than putting your wife into a cell and almost starving her. That's very much more extreme. Okay. Now,
and Roger, what would you say to people who are afraid of being drawn close to God because of what he'll ask?
I would say that the suffering is worth it, that any suffering he would give you is worth it because of the joy of being closer to his heart.
He gives you joys, too, is what you're saying.
Right.
I mean, the joy of himself.
Not just in heaven, but on earth. The joy of being close to his loving heart counterbalances the sufferings of having a more sacrificial life, for instance.
Yeah, and it's real joy. I mean, of course, you don't always feel the joy, but oftentimes you do of his presence. It's not it's not a joy that a worldly pleasure that doesn't really satisfy.
Oh, all right. He is an example of this. This is very personal, but since this is the last program I'm going to do on avoiding bitterness and suffering, I might as well put it all out there.
Good, Rhonda. Do.
Okay. So when my husband died, he died when I was 57. He was 74. And I was looking around for second husbands, preferably saints. Well, all these men rejected me, and it was very painful.
Oh.
And I could have thought, Jesus, why did you allow me to suffer these rejections this way? But then he called me to make him my second bridegroom as a dedicated widow. And I have so much joy in being a dedicated widow. And whenever by chance I happen to meet some of these men who rejected me, it's just crystal clear to me, hindsight, that it would have been a nightmare.
Yeah, right. Sort of like Cecilia. No, I'm teasing. Cornelia, rather. Yeah.
So there you are. So the pain, by giving myself up to God's permissive will and accepting his will and giving up looking for these men who weren't suitable anyway, I don't mean they were monsters. They were wonderful men in different ways, but probably very incompatible with me is what I mean.
Right.
Okay, so...
I just want to say also, Rhonda, that I wanted to marry very badly for years and years and years. And finally, not until I was 49, I realized that God was calling me to celibacy. A little late, I realized, but still. And he made it crystal clear that this is what he wanted from me. And it was a long process of discernment, and I needed to get healing and emotional healing in the middle of it. But anyway, my dream was to marry, and it really cost me to go forward, to make a vow of celibacy. But when I did, I had so much more joy afterwards. So that doesn't mean all my life is only going to be an experience of joy. It's not. And it hasn't been, but I had real joy after that.
Yes, exactly. Okay, but I want to tell you more about the amazing end of the story of St. Godoliva. There she was shut up in a cell and almost starved to death. She escapes to her father's house and complains to the bishop. And then he gets hold of her husband, and he promises to improve, and he has permission to take her back. Instead, he goes off on a trip arranging beforehand that Godoliva be drowned by one of his servants. So he actually murdered his wife. And she died at the age of 21, presumably from an accident, okay?
Yeah.
Now listen to this unexpected ending. Her husband remarries, and his daughter is born blind. But when her eyes were washed in the water from the pool where Godoliva had been drowned, the baby was miraculously healed. Thunderstruck by this sign of forgiveness, Berthold confessed plotting the murder and entered a monastery where he lived a life of penance. How about that?
Right, quite amazing. So she was praying.
The most amazing things can happen to people. And I like to tell these amazing stories because I find in myself and others, we have a tendency to write off as monsters people who do horrible things that we hear about. For instance, you look at the headlines of the news, and you hear these horrible things, and you say, oh, what a monster. What a monster. He did this.
That's
so
did this. True, Rhonda. You know, that's such a good point, that we don't have faith that these people can change.
Yeah, we have to pray for them to change. Now, of course, there may be many who never change, but just the same, we have to.
Many do.
Help us to see anything is possible.
In the lives of the saints, you see that, you know, right, you were talking about St. Catherine of Genoa and how her husband ended up, you know, taking care of the poorest of the poor and living a life of penance. So,
yes,
it happens. If you're married to a saint who's praying for your conversion. No, but we do have to pray for people. Okay.
Yes. So it's amazing to me, you know, people will say, I ask someone, for instance, in a political battle, someone is vilifying the politician who they hate. Okay, so I say, oh, you pray for him or her. And they say, oh, yes. So I say, do you spend as much time praying for him or her as you spend telling stories ridiculing him or her?
Mm-hmm.
See, that's
very good point. Very good point. And, yeah, it's not okay to hate our political enemies. They're not. That's not like an exception in Jesus' command to love your enemy, right? A lot of us do that without thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we hate the sin of what the false things they're doing and thinking, but we still shouldn't hate them as persons.
Right.
So, you know, Christianity is just not a mild little religion and a way to contemplate with Jesus as your wisdom figure or archetype. It's a huge challenge, right?
Right.
So, here's another very challenged wife, much more famous, is St. Rita of Cassia, and she is 1381 to 1457. And she also wanted to be a nun, but she was an only child, and her parents wanted her to stay in the world and take care of them, and that she marry. And so she was given in marriage to a quick-tempered, brutal man, was involved in town feuds. This is Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And their two sons also were violent in temper. And she bears all this out of gentle love, trying to cover over the faults of her male family members. And shortly before his death, her husband converted and tried to make up for his abusive behavior, but he was killed by an assassin. And this is a town feud, so his son said they were going to avenge his death by killing their father's enemies. And Rita begs them to practice the mercy of Jesus instead of perpetrating this feud. So finally, she can't convince them, and she prays that they should rather die still innocent than live to commit sins of murder. And within a year, both sons died.
How incredible.
So now she's free to become a nun, and she gets a sort of stigmata in the form of a thorn in her head. Now, imagine this. She goes into the convent, and she doesn't do so well in the convent, after all. First of all, she's like now 40 years old, and the other young women are 20 in the novitiate. Mm-hmm. And so she led a very difficult life in the convent also, but she was a great saint and great intercessor, devoted to contemplation. And So, what should we say?
That you mean, it wasn't all smooth sailing after she became a nun.
Yeah. See, we shouldn't think that. Many people who are, as a matter of fact, some married people who are in unhappy marriages kind of wish their husbands would die and they could be liberated and they could become nuns. Mm-hmm. It usually isn't so easy when they become nuns either.
No.
Okay, now we already talked about, well, before we go further, let's go to, with other examples, let's go to steps to sanctification in the midst of marital discord.
Yes, I agree. That's a good idea. Because, Rhonda, a lot of people listening to this in our times would say, well, why didn't they just leave their husbands? They should have left. I feel you have you sum up the alternatives here very well.
Yes. See, now, we don't want to say, first of all, in our time, we understand much better from psychology how people who are abusive in this way, it's not just a sporadic sin, it's a whole psychological pattern that would be very difficult to change. I mean, they can be changed by miracle or by all sorts of spiritual healings, but that's rare. And we see also because in those days, an abused woman, if they had a large family, see, in some cases, if you were a woman, you have a family with many brothers. Those brothers would take care of that guy if he was doing that to you. Right. But nowadays, when people live often just a husband and wife and the kids in some city where they don't have any relatives where they could run to, what would happen to them if they left? They don't see that they could. It's nice for us to say, who are many people listening to a radio program like this are probably middle class. Okay, so it's nice for a middle class person to say, well, you can live more simply. But to a poor woman who's actually facing that if she ran away with her kids from an abusive husband, they would actually starve. That's a very, very difficult thing to face.
It is, and that's quite common. I mean, I don't know about how common that would be in the U.S. I don't know that anybody, they would starve to death. They'd certainly be very poor, but it's quite common in Central and Latin America.
Yes, well, they're all different conditions. But in any case, nowadays, happily, they have women's shelters, and I'm not very personally familiar with them, but I've heard of people who went to women's shelters where they train them how, if your husband does this to you, like battering, you call the police, and you come with the kids to the shelter, and we take care of you until we figure out how you could get on assistance, state assistance, and things like that. And they help people find solutions. Okay. So the church because there's no divorce, I mean, you can't remarry. It's not that the church doesn't say you can't divorce. They say you can't remarry if it's a valid marriage. But if it's an invalid marriage, see, nowadays, canon lawyers know about all these psychological things. So in a case like that, they would often say that man was not able to be married psychologically, to have a good Christian marriage. And so it's not truly a marriage, and so you can marry again, and so on. That's a long discussion.
No, but it's good to point out that many of these marriages, some of these marriages are invalid because the spouse wasn't capable of being a spouse.
Yes, but then that has been exaggerated by many to consider any kind of personality conflict as a reason for a divorce.
Right.
Now, that's ridiculous because you can't make it seem as if all the women who are abused in any way, especially psychological battery, that they themselves are saints because their husband is a batterer. So a woman who, for instance, is constantly tormenting her husband by having love affairs with other men, and the husband beats her up one day, that's a very different scenario than these saint stories, right?
Right.
Yeah. So anyhow, so we have some saints who complained about their husbands, like Galileva actually complaining to the bishop. Marguerite Youville didn't complain. Then you have others who, like Cornelia, didn't just say, well, Cornelia Connolly, my husband wants me back, so I have to do it because I'm under my husband's rule. You know, things like that.
That's
okay.
Right. So she defied her husband's, wrong demands.
Yes, especially
and you have several other stories of women who divorced or left their husbands, of saints. So, and then in other cases, as you point out, you tell us about the other path.
Okay. But in the case of other women saints, such as Rita and Marguerite Youville, even suffering from opposition or emotional abandonment, they patiently forbear, and eventually, when they become widows, they live as they wish to live without this oppression. So it's very, very important that anyone who is in an unhappy marriage go for help to the parish, because there are these different groups like Marriage Encounter or Retro Vi, where other couples to deal with conflict or to make the right decision.
Yes. I've heard wonderful things about Retro Vi helping people's marriages. There's also a group called Compassion Power, which is supposed to be good for husbands who are abusive. But that said, I mean, Retro Vi is more, I would say, for people who are in very unhappy marriages, let's say, but not where one spouse is absolutely abusive.
Yeah,
I know of a couple who the husband was cheating on the wife, kind of incessantly, and they went to 4 marriage counselors, handpicked by the wife's sister, who was an expert, none of which worked, and then they went to Retro Vi and it saved the marriage. And the man wrote them a check for $30,000.
Oh, my goodness.
You can go to Retro Vi and pay whatever you
can afford. People who are listening to this program who don't speak French, the word Retro Vi is a French word, and it's spelled, could you spell it for them?
Yes, Rhonda, I believe it's RETROUVILLE. I'll spell that again, and you can Google it. RETROUVILLE. And if you didn't catch that, ask your parish priest or someone in your parish who's devout the name of the Catholic marriage program. I would just say it's run by Catholics, but you can go if you're secular and it's not explicitly Catholic.
Now, what I noticed for Marriage Encounter couples that I've known, which is for people who are in marriages where there's conflict, but not where it's so bad they're on the verge of divorce. They're just very unhappily married, let's say. Yeah. I just love to see them after they get into this. You see a couple in the parish who you know, and they walk into church, they never look at each other. At the gesture of peace, They just look past each other and shake hands with other people. If you see them at a gathering, they're as far apart as possible, doing their own thing. And then, after they go to marriage encounter and they start practicing these techniques of reconciliation and of communication, there they are at church smiling at each other, holding hands.
Isn't that fantastic?
And the way I see it playing out is that the same thing which annoyed them so much and made them think they hated each other, they now laugh at each other for the same things.
Yes.
So they've just accepted, oh, my wife is always late. I mean, in some cases where this is possible, see, there are all sorts of compromises that can be made in a marriage if people put their minds to it. See, this gets into the whole thing of anger management, where people don't like to admit it, but people like being angry. It's not just that the other person angers me, it's that I like being angry. And one of the most surprising things I heard from a therapist was that one of the reasons that people who would tend to be a little depressed, they get an adrenaline rush when they're angry. How about that?
That's interesting, because a lot of the people I know who are very angry also have a low-grade depression problem.
It's like in normal life you feel like I just have to do one damn thing after another every day, but when I have a drama queen episode, I feel life is exciting.
Right. Now, I want to just say we have a show. Dr. Ronda's written a book, Taming the Lion Within, about how to overcome anger, and we did a show with her about that. If you could listen to that on Rivers of Living Water's website. And there's also, we went in quite a bit into that in our show on meeting Christ in frustration. We talked a great deal about anger in that show. I recommend listening to it if you have an anger problem, both of them. So, but I want to just say that I have been told I knew someone whose brother and sister-in-law went to VIII, and she said they had the worst marriage of anyone she knew. But of course there was no physical abuse or real emotional abuse. And she says, and now their marriage is tolerable. You know, they didn't ride off into the sunset, but it's okay, you know?
Oh, yeah, that's certainly better. Like, it's better to have a B- marriage than an F marriage, if you will.
Right. That's pretty good. So Retrovi, and Retrovi, I just want to say, if you're a cleaning woman, you give what you want. So it's a weekend thing, and if you only can give $1 or $5, that's fine.
It's good to know, too. That's very good to know. Well, I want to just tell people, because this is the last one, there are other chapters in this book of mine called Avoiding Bitterness and Suffering with the Help of Our Heroes, how our heroes found peace amid sorrow. So I want to tell you again how to get this book, and you can get it from Sophia Press. Sophia is spelled Sophia, or you can just Google my name, Chervin, not S, Chervin. That's Cherv for Victor, IN for Nancy, and put in Avoiding Bitterness and Suffering, and it'll come up, and you can get hold of the book and give it to your friends. Any friends you have who are bitter also could benefit. And so, we're concluding. Let
me just say, I just want to say this is a very, very beautiful book, and I have found it deeply consoling, and I recommend it to everyone. And Dr. Chervin, Ronda, thinks this is her best book. I don't know about that, but it's a wonderful book. But can I just say one thing here, Ronda? We discussed the first alternative of leaving your husband, who's abusive, or spouse, and then the second alternative, you mentioned that there were saints who, even though they suffered from opposition or even brutality, stayed in the marriage. I just wanted to quote you from your book. You said, "These women so much experienced themselves as brides of Christ in their souls that they could transcend the pain caused by the attitudes of their husbands." So that's sort of the second path. So
the middle path would be to separate, and then when you separate, when you're under a group of people who are working with you, they work on each of you on compromises. So it's not either put up with terrible conditions and offer it up or leave. There's the possibility of humbly seeking counsel, even for one of you. Sometimes people say, well, my husband or my wife would never go to such a thing. But if you go, it will improve the marriage, usually.
That's right. That's a very good, important point. And probably for most marriages, that's the thing to do, is to start by seeking counseling.
Yes.
From a good Christian counselor, let us say, because there are people who, there are good marriage counselors and marriage counselors who will immediately suggest divorce, and that can be very destabilizing for a marriage.
Yes.
Yeah, but I agree with that. You can also threaten, if the spouse refuses to go to counseling, you can go to counseling, and if they still don't get into counseling, your counselor can work with you for how to get, you can say to them, well, if you don't go to counseling, I'm going to leave. Even though you may not even intend that, but you can just do that to scare them into going. And often that will work.
But sometimes it just takes being more assertive about your own needs. Like an example from my own marriage, I know we only have 3 minutes left, but an example from my own, the counselor I went to just said, look, if you're up all night taking care of your sick husband, and then you go to work, let them make breakfast. You don't have to make breakfast for them.
Right.
But just because, so I was making breakfast and grumbling every day, grinding my teeth while making breakfast, instead of just saying, hey, you guys, you make breakfast whenever you feel like it, and I'll go off to work. So sometimes there's so many things that you could do to make things better, but it takes an outside counselor to get you to do it because you're just into a pattern of anger.
That's
you don't change anything, you just grumble.
That's right.
So grumbling is a form of bitterness. So I want to thank Mary Schwarz for inviting me to talk about my book on her program, and I hope to talk to her about other books of mine in the future. And I just think she's wonderful at drawing out her guests, and I hope that all of you who have listened will benefit by this program and also the archived one.
Yes, Rhonda, thank you for being on the show. It's been wonderful, and I'm feeling a little sad, but we'll be having you back, I hope. And you have been listening to Rivers of Living Water with Mary Schwarz, a show about how to grow in holiness. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. Rhonda, would you lead us in a prayer?
Okay. May all of us, dear Jesus, we want to just be close to you, and we accept any sufferings that we can't get away from. We accept them as your permissive will, and we beg you to bring anyone who has caused us suffering to repentance and conversion, that one day we will all be happily together in your arms in heaven. Amen.
Amen.
We'll be back a week from today, same time, same station, on WCAT Radio. And in the meantime, may the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.